it's I do think that there is a space to add robots to our toolkit of what we can use in therapy. And I do think that there's a space for people to even treat robots a little bit like pets and benefit from those relationships, even though they are completely one-sided relationships. So I talk about that a little bit in the book. And then I also talk about where I do see some issues with that, which is the fact that robots are made by people, again, or companies, or could be used by governments, that the fact that robots can collect data, the fact that robots can be designed in certain ways to reinforce certain societal stereotypes. And and you had asked about, I think, what were you getting at the uncanny valley theory in your question?
Oh, get there as well. I was interested in knowing if you feel there is a certain point where, and I presume it's going to be personal, but sometimes it can be, it might mean that many people, where there's a point in which an object, you do start to get that beginning of that level of empathy, the beginning of the sense that there is something inside that, even though you know there's not. So starting from that point, because sometimes there's objects that look so far from being human, but have some sense of movement or have something which means that you can't help but project a sense of almost sentience.
Yeah, I mean, it happens very quickly because we're so biologically hardwired to do this projection onto autonomous movement. In fact, there are studies that show that our brains that indicate that our brains are scanning our environments and trying to separate things into objects and agents, because evolutionarily we've had to watch out for the agents. And so when we see autonomous movement in our physical space, we automatically treat that like a living thing. But also we respond very strongly to faces and eyes. I have a newborn baby at home, and the first thing that she learned to recognize was a face, right? It doesn't even have to be my face. I could draw a picture on a piece of paper and hold it in front of her, and she would respond to it. That's because we have this ingrained tendency to project ourselves, to project, and especially when we see these features in something else. And so you can design robots to really enhance this effect. And it's really interesting that they don't need to necessarily look like humans. In fact, when we try to design them to look too much like humans, people tend to get disappointed or creeped out because the robot doesn't behave quite the way that they're expecting. They have a pre-informed notion about what the robot is supposed to do because it looks human. And when it does something slightly different, it throws off the expectations that we have. But if you build a robot that looks like a baby harp seal, which most people have not ever held in their arms before, you're more willing to suspend your disbelief. Or a baby dinosaur that people have never seen before. Or, take anything. Pixar has figured out how to animate blobs to have emotion and for us to project onto them. So that's what robot designers are trying to do. And again, it doesn't even have to be intentional. You can take a robot vacuum cleaner, which was not intentionally designed to evoke this response, and people will still treat it like a pet and name it.
See, that's I mean, I suppose working from the other way of the original way I asked the question, which is, almost putting a mop on top of a lawnmower. You might be, but if you have something that looks like a ventriloquist dummy or a mannequin, we feel, and that's a very interesting side, as you're saying, that alienation, that bit where you go, oh, that's not right, that's wrong, but the lawnmower with the mop on it, getting on okay with that.
Yeah, and it's funny to see right now. I feel like we're at such an interesting moment in time because we've had robots for 5 decades, but they've been behind the scenes, and now we have robots coming into shared spaces. Like there's a robot at my grocery store, or I was just down in Ocean City, New Jersey in the US, which is a beach town, and they had a robot in the restaurant, and the robot was like bringing food to the tables, and it wasn't taking anyone's job because it couldn't even like take the food off of itself. Like they still had people working in the restaurant, but the robot is moving around and interacting with people, and people are fascinated by it. All the kids go to see it. It's a tourist attraction now, even though it's completely useless. And so right now, as robots come into these spaces, we're starting to see the importance of human-robot interaction research and the design decisions that people make, because there's some robots that creep people out. They don't like them at all. And there's some robots that people love and think are great. And we're starting to see like the mistakes that people are making in like the growing pains of the companies putting these robots out into the world. I think it's very interesting.
I find it fascinating. I don't know if you've seen much of this work. I think it's mainly done or there's certainly a place in Bristol in the southwest of England where people with prosthetic limbs, in particular children, I don't know if you've seen where the company has started to make them so that you can have Iron Man's hand, or you can have Luke Skywalker's hand from Empire Strikes Back. And it's been really interesting to see how young people, they've changed the relationship with something that's been attached to them with a different sense of familiarity. And I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm throwing this just at you out of nowhere, but it intrigues me again about our relationship with the mechanized, especially when it becomes part of you, and the way that it can be made so you feel, and other people also feel, less alienated by it.
Oh yeah, that's such a great example. That's a perfect example of how, rather than trying to recreate an arm perfectly, we have more success even if we create something different for the kids, something fun, so a reference to a movie that they like, or even something entirely different. I find it so boring when we get caught up in trying to recreate ourselves perfectly, when we can create something entirely different and have much more fun with it, more utility with it. I'm all for, experimenting with those things and trying to find something that's better than recreating an arm.
Also, I wanted to ask you again, actually, this is from another robotics lab down in Bristol in England, which is about, there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and the speed at which it's moving. And then, as you said already, and as your friend said as well, like worrying about the overpopulation of Mars. But I'm also intrigued by emotion, because that seems to be in some of the robots that you talk about, and some of the decision making, if we can call it decision making, which is very often binary, that there is that point where it seems it's impossible. I think the one that I saw was, it was basically a program which was to stop what appeared to be a man falling down a hole, and it would work fine. There was a robotic program. Every time this human figure would walk towards the hole, the robot, but if you place two human beings walking towards the hole, a decision can't be made and both will fall in the hole. And that seems, because you mentioned the trolley problem as well in the book, and that seemed to in some ways remind me of those philosophical problems, which it turns out emotion is required for decision making. And as far as I can see, AI is a long way from us being able to create anything, because I mean that's an incredible level of consciousness.
Oh yeah, so we are not anywhere close to an AI being able to engage in that type of human decision making, and nor do I think that we will get there or even should get there. Again, I think that trying to recreate human intelligence is both a very difficult goal, but also not the right goal. Why are we trying to recreate human intelligence when we can create something different, which AI is? I mean, machines are already very smart. They can beat us at a lot of things. They can beat us at chess, at Go, at Jeopardy. They can see patterns in data. They can work tirelessly. They can do amazing things, and they're getting better. The technology is getting better every day, but they don't learn or perceive the world or think like people do. So it's a very different type of intelligence. I don't think we should be trying to recreate it. And when it comes to moral decision making, I feel like we often get caught up in this idea that we need to make the machines more like us to solve the problem of unanticipated harm, like a moral decision, like which person do you save from falling into the hole? If you look at kind of the proposed solutions for the trolley problem or for a problem like that, it's usually, oh, we need to program morals into the machines so that they understand how to make the right decision, or it's we need to find a way to hold the machine itself accountable. That goes hand in hand with that. And I think that's a very misguided way of looking at it, because one of the things that the original trolley problem in philosophy is supposed to show is that humans don't have consistent ethics. It's hard enough for us to decide on what rules to follow, and then it's even harder to program those into a machine that thinks differently about things than we do. So I think that that's maybe not the right goal. And again, I think a comparison to animals actually helps here, because if you view the machine as an animal, you don't immediately leap to the conclusion that we need to hold it to our moral standards or teach it to, follow our ethics or legal rules. Rather, you try to find a way to assign responsibility to a human or an organization that owns the animal so that the harm can be reduced that way. And I think that that's a much more practical way to look at robots and AI, especially currently when their decision-making is not sophisticated in the way that human decision-making is. I think that we need to look to animals and look to the history of how we've dealt with this with animals in order to at least step away from this idea that the robot itself should be accountable or somehow need to understand human morals to make decisions like that.
Now, thinking of that kind of the development of morality and ethics, you mentioned in the book that because also you, at the time of writing, you'd recently had a child who was moving from babydom to toddlerdom, and a lot of people were wondering whether you were in that kind of somewhere between Charles Darwin and B.F. Skinner mode of just going, right, I'm just going to do, because Darwin, of course, loved doing little, very friendly research on his children. Do you feel that watching the development, I mean, especially things like as you start to see empathy developing in children, has that had an effect on your relationship, also the thoughts about AI?
It has, and people often ask me about this now that I have kids, or even from the moment I first got pregnant. They'll say, oh, you must find it so interesting to watch your children develop just like an AI would develop. And it's actually illustrated the opposite for me, which is that these are very different types of intelligence that are nothing alike. And my child learns so differently and understands the world so differently than any machine that I've ever encountered, that it's only just made me more firmly in camp. We have to stop comparing artificial intelligence and human intelligence. I mean, the most fascinating thing to me about my baby right now isn't like, can I train it like B.F. Skinner trained pigeons to peck at something? It's the fact that my baby will smile at a stuffed animal. I mean, that social nature that is in us is so fascinating to me, and it is so much more interesting when you think about how we might start to relate to these machines that we perceive as social, even though they have nothing of the sort inside of them, than just looking at, how can I train my child like I would train a robot?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing, isn't it? That idea that something can be programmed as opposed to everything, as far as we can see, so much of what we become is through experience. How are we able to, that's while you're mentioning B.F. Skinner, this is something that I'd never heard about this. Operation Pigeon. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, Operation Pigeon was, you could say it was one of the first concepts for an automated missile guidance system. So B.F. Skinner had the idea to put pigeons inside of a missile and train them to peck at a target. And he would have 3 pigeons per missile, and the idea was if they all pecked enough at the same target, then it would guide the missile to the target. And apparently it worked, but it got canceled. It never actually got put into practice. But yeah, this idea that automated weapon systems are very new is also a bit of a fallacy, since we've been trying to do this for a while with animals.
Do you have a favourite? Because you also mentioned, you mentioned the film Day of the Dolphin, which is almost entirely forgotten. Mike Nichols, a very famous director, George C. Scott, and kind of influenced by John C. Lilly's work and Margaret Howe on dolphins. And I wondered, looking at those different things where we've seen the attempts to communicate with animals and to also see how they can sometimes, their consciousness can be used. Is there any particular experiment you've seen with animals which you feel is the most influential in terms of us beginning to think about how we might create that communication with some form of artificial intelligence?
That's a good question. I don't know what the earliest one would be, but there are just so many amazing examples of partnerships between humans and animals, and how we've really been able to, so you mentioned the dolphins. I mean, the United States Navy still has a dolphin training program because the dolphins have such a good echolocation system that they can find underwater mines and lost equipment and all sorts of things. So That's one that exists into the present day. But millennia ago, we started using oxen to plow fields, or there's this fun bird called the honey guide that has formed an evolutionary, it seems, partnership with humans, where it leads the humans to honey, and then the humans harvest the honey, and the honey guide can harvest all the grubs and the bugs that are left behind in the wreckage. So there's amazing ways that we've combined our skills when we can't do something by ourselves, and in particular, humans have made use of animals. Not always in the kindest way either, but we've very much benefited from harnessing the skill sets that are supplemental to our own in the past.
Do you see a point where, I mean, I was thinking when I was reading your book occasionally about that Descartes, I think it was, who talked about the fact that he didn't believe that animals, non-human animals, had any feelings, and that if you kicked a dog, I think it was only the equivalent of basically banging a key on a piano. That was the noise it was making. There was nothing. And it feels to me that as we have begun to learn about more of what we might call the sense of an inner experience of animals, that do you see us that we will go through that same stage at some point with artificial intelligence, with robotic intelligence?
I wonder about that, because and I write a lot about this in the book, but if you look at where we are with animals in Western society, we haven't really gotten there yet. We're still, I think we like to believe that we care about animal suffering and animal sentience, and in some ways we do, but if you look at all of the laws that we've passed, we're very hypocritical about protecting the animals that we find cute or that we care about culturally, and not caring about other animals. So it seems, if you look at the entire history of Western animal rights, it seems that we care much, much more about what we relate to than anything that's intrinsic to the animals. And in that sense, it's actually a pretty good analogy to robots. Now, of course, animals can feel, and animals do suffer, and robots can't and do not. But unless we stop to think about this, I view us taking kind of the same path, where it might make us feel uncomfortable to see a robot be abused if it is compelling and lifelike and mimics pain really well. That might make us so uncomfortable that we don't want it to happen. If you think of, there's that TV show Westworld, if you think of that being possible to build, and having people be able to go to this theme park where they can do whatever they want to these very lifelike robots and torture them and kill them and do whatever they feel like, I think there are going to be a lot of questions about, is that good for people? Is that a healthy outlet for violent behavior, or does that train their cruelty muscles? So I do see us having kind of the same instinct to maybe want to protect the robots and not have to witness this violent behavior. But it again has more to do with what we relate to and how we feel about certain designs of robots, rather than whether the robot actually feels anything, since we don't care about that at all when it comes to animals. And my hope is actually that this juxtaposition of us caring about robots as we start to realize that this is happening might actually make us reflect on how hypocritical we've been when it comes to animals. And we might actually think a little bit more about protecting things that do feel, because if we don't stop to think about it, we will just default to our usual hypocrisy of thinking we care about intrinsic qualities when really we just care about what we care about.